I now call the Minister to move motion number 4 on dangerous drugs. Minister to move.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that the committee has considered the draft Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 Amendment Order 2019. I'm sure members of the House will have noticed that this is an amendment which is based on scientific and technical detail and is therefore distinct from other amendments to the Misuse of Drugs Act that have recently been brought forward for debate. And it's in that context, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to place on record my thanks to the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs for its expert advice on the matter and for its continued work, which has informed the draft order before the committee today. The order was first laid before Parliament on the 4th of June. To be clear, the purpose of this order is to amend Schedule 2 to the Misuse of Drugs Act by reducing the scope of the generic definition referred to as the third generation of synthetic cannabinoids. I should clarify, Mr Deputy Speaker, given the concerns expressed in other debates on this subject, that this does not repeal the generic definition and compounds commonly known as Spice and Mamba, which will remain subject to control. This measure follows the recommendation from the Advisory Council, which was published on the 22nd of December 2017. I hope it will be helpful to members if I explain the background to the recent control on these drugs and why the government is making this amendment.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and actually I'm very relieved that he specifically mentioned Spice. As someone who worked for a short time in the Ministry of Justice, I've seen exactly the damage that comes from that particular drug. Will the Minister also confirm to me this is simply, in effect, a sort of tidying up exercise, a technical change, and this statutory instrument doesn't mean in any way a looser regime of drug licence management?
No, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and like him, I've seen directly the results of Spice Man directly on the streets of Newcastle, out on patrol, and we've had passionate debates in this place, particularly with the member for Mansfield and Torbay, who are passionate about the impact of these drugs on town centres. So I can assure him and other colleagues that this is not in any way a relaxation of controls. This is simply a response to representations made by the science and research scientific community about the need to revisit these regulations because of some unintended consequences when they were originally tabled. And it's on that basis I'm delighted to give way.
To the Minister for giving way. And it's really good to hear the government accepting solid evidence when it comes to drugs issues, because it has not got a very good record in this respect. In Scotland, we will have 1,000 drug deaths in the last year, and the Scottish Affairs Committee are having an inquiry to have a look at the reasons behind this. One of the things that we've found is the Misuse of Drugs Act gets in the way of treatment and recovery and is an impediment to dealing with this. Yet the Home Office won't send a minister to our inquiry. Will he now confirm today and now that a Home Office minister will turn up, give evidence and defend the government's approach to drug use?
Well, I'm more than happy to speak to the honourable member offline about this, in the sense that I'm not aware of the underlying issue, but I certainly do agree with him about the absolute need to proceed in this complex and extremely sensitive area on the basis of evidence. And I'm more than happy to have a conversation with him outside the chamber about the Scottish question and situation, because I'm not aware of that problem. I think it would be helpful, Mr Deputy Speaker, perhaps if I gave some background to the recent control on these drugs and why the government is making this amendment. We rely on independent experts, the ACMD, and they published advice first in 2014 on the third generation of synthetic cannabinoids, a group of compounds which mimic the effects of cannabis, commonly referred to as Spice and Mamba. The advice recommended that these compounds be captured by way of a generic definition as Class B drugs under the Misuse of Drugs Act due to the harms and widespread availability. This followed the control of the first generation of synthetic cannabinoids in 2019 and the second generation in 2013. The ACMD also recommended these be placed in Schedule 1 of the Misuse of Drug Regulations 2001, as the ACMD could not confirm any known medicinal uses at the time. Placing these compounds in Schedule 1, Mr Deputy Speaker, means that they have little or no known medicinal or therapeutic benefits in the UK and can only be legally accessed with a Home Office licence, which is generally issued for research or industrial purposes. Following the ACMD's recommendations, these changes came into effect on the 14th of December 2016. However, shortly after implementation, the ACMD and the Home Office were informed by representatives from the research community that the breadth of the definition meant that a large number of research compounds were inadvertently captured, many of which were reported not to be synthetic cannabinoids. As a result of the broad generic definition, research institutions were put in a position where they needed to obtain Schedule 1 licences where they may not otherwise have needed them. The licensing process is of course in place to ensure that there is a minimised risk of misuse, diversion and harm of controlled drugs. However, as I'm sure the House will agree, we would not wish to place substances under control and make them subject to the licensing requirements where there is no need to do so. As such, it is important that we amend this definition, which has created an additional formal regulatory burden for the research industry on compounds that were never intended to be controlled. To remedy this, the ACMD provided a further recommendation in December 2017 to reduce the scope of the generic definition. The order then, Mr Deputy Speaker, amends the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 to reduce the scope of the generic definition of the third generation of synthetic cannabinoids. The ACMD's amended definition will reduce the number of compounds unintentionally captured by the generic definition while retaining those compounds that have been found to cause harm. Owing to the continued harms posed by the third generation of synthetic cannabinoids, this order does not repeal the generic definition, and I again would want to repeat for clarity that the compounds with street names such as Spice and Mamba will continue to be caught by the generic definition. This order, if accepted and made, will come into force on the 15th of November. In addition to this order, a further statutory instrument will be reduced via the negative resolution procedure to make necessary parallel amendments to the generic definition under Schedule 1 of the Misuse of Drugs Regulations 2001 and in the Misuse of Drugs Designation England, Wales and Scotland Order 2015. This would mean that those compounds unintentionally captured will no longer require a Home Office licence for the conduct of research, as they would no longer be controlled. I hope I've made the case to the House to amend the generic definition of the third generation of synthetic cannabinoids in order to remove a number of compounds from the generic definition which were unintentionally controlled. And on that basis, Mr Deputy Speaker, I commend this order to the committee.
The question is motion number 4 as on the order paper. Caroline Harris.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We will not be opposing this SI today. In fact, we welcome the proposed amendment to the Misuse of Drugs Act. Revising the generic definition for synthetic cannabinoids will mean that compounds never intended to be controlled will be removed, whilst those most likely to be misused and cause harm will be retained. But that said, we must ensure that any change to drug policy does not add to the problems that we're already facing in this country when it comes to controlling the use of drugs. The government's approach to drugs since they took office in 2010 has been ideological and plagued with irresponsible cuts. The UK now has the highest recorded level of mortality from drugs misuse since records began. Under this government, the UK has become the drug overdose capital of Europe. There is nothing more important than preserving the life of our citizens, but the current approach to drugs is woeful and is failing to do this. Therefore, it must be time to consider different approaches based on what would be most effective at reducing harm, such as overdose prevention units, commonly known as drug consumption rooms, a place that will take people off the streets, provide a safe environment, clean needles and somewhere where they can be engaged in treatment to combat their addiction. Labour would support piloting these schemes. And cannabis oil for medical purposes. Last October there appeared to be a breakthrough on this when the Home Office brought in legislation to allow expert doctors to legally issue prescriptions for cannabis-based medicines if they believe such treatment could benefit their patient. But as we've learned from recent high-profile cases, there appears to be some confusion around the Home Office guidelines when it comes to bringing the substances into the UK. So we need assurances from the government benches that any changes they are making to drugs policy will be fully implemented, clear in how they will be delivered and effective immediately. We on these benches recognise that there needs to be a complete shift of emphasis, understanding and effectiveness of the UK drugs policy, and we would be looking to establish a suitable forum such as a Royal or a Parliamentary Commission to identify what works and what we need to do to make our drugs policy efficient. So whilst we support today's SI and welcome the changes as positive advances in drugs policy, there is still a long way to go in the bigger picture of drug control and legislation.
Sorry, Gavin Newland.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The SNP also supports the order before us today, for many reasons, a lot of which are contained in this fantastic report from the Health and Social Care Committee that was published this morning, but not least because we believe that the potential under the current regime exists for research and investigation into medical cannabinoids hindered, in some cases blocked completely. I think all of us will have had constituents contact them about medicinal cannabis and the potential positive impact they feel it will have on them or their families in the face of sometimes horrendous medical conditions. I know that there are no simple answers to many of the questions facing authorities in the government, and that opinions in this place and throughout society are varied and sometimes conflicting, but surely a primary duty of government and the state to ensure the best possible health and welfare of its citizens. And I hope that we can all agree that those with chronic health conditions, sometimes causing unimaginable pain and suffering, should not be denied the potential fruits of research into cannabinoids because, put simply, the legislation hasn't kept pace with the scientific progress being made. And as the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs made clear in the letter to the Minister in 2017, when referring to the current statutory position, that there are potential delays to clinical research as compounds within the scope of the MDR which move into trials in humans need to obtain appropriate licences and put practical arrangements in place for clinical trial sites. It's also important to note that the Council's recommendations, which have led to the order we are discussing today, were based on wide consultation with those directly involved in and managing clinical research, including the British Pharmacological Society, the Medical Research Council and the Royal Society of Chemistry. So we welcome the prospect of such trials and research becoming easier and more simplified for those involved in research. It's only through the scientific method of hypothesis testing and analysis that our pharmacologists, that's easy for me to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, and clinicians can make the discoveries necessary to develop and improve on the treatment and medication available to those in desperate need. That's the story of all modern medicine in recent history, and I'm glad that this order will give the scientific community some of the tools and legal protections needed in that regard. We now know, of course, of the problems, or some of the problems encountered by those attempting to access medicinal cannabis since the relaxation of legislation last year, and I hope that those who have been stymied in their attempts to secure medication and treatments for their loved ones will see the changes in policy today as progress that they themselves have driven. It is disappointing, however, that the Minister in his reply to the CMD earlier this year did not take the opportunity to take on board some of the Council's other recommendations that they feel would help scientific research and in the long run potentially help more people in need of improved and transformative medication. I understand the reasons the Minister gave in his letter. However, I would ask that he give the Council's recommendations further consideration, coming as they are from a body not known for proposing such changes in law lightly. Now, I would be failing, Mr Deputy Speaker, if I were not to draw comparisons between the broadly sensible and pragmatic approach taken by the UK Government in this instance, albeit slowly, with the head in the sand attitude to the cross-party consensus. We've just heard it from the Labour front bench in Glasgow for progress on drug treatment facilities in that city. The west of Scotland, as has been highlighted by Fen for Perth and North Perthshire, has an appalling level of illegal drug abuse and addiction and a high number of deaths. And the Home Office's refusal to allow the health authorities and the third sector organisations in Glasgow to try and alleviate some of that suffering is in marked contrast to the spirit in which we're discussing this SI today. Not so long ago, this government set its face against even entertaining the idea of medical cannabis, yet here we are today. And so in that spirit, I implore the Minister and his government to think again on safe drug consumption rooms. We should be in the business of saving lives, which is exactly what this approach would do. We must give our pharmacologists and scientists every advantage we can as they seek to discover new treatments and medications, but more importantly, we must alleviate the suffering of those like Alfred Ingley and Billy Caldwell who have waited too long. For us, all of us, to get our collective finger out in this place in terms of improving the legislation. We also look to the families, many of whom feel forced to smuggle in this life-changing treatment for their children. And I'd like to pay tribute, she's not in her place today, but I'd like to pay tribute to Honourable Member for the Gower, who recently travelled over to Netherlands with Emma Appleby to secure the medicine required for her epileptic daughter Tegan. The issues they faced with Border Force initially confiscating the medicine amid much confusion highlighted not only the inconsistency in the law, but the law is in itself not fit for purpose. The families are also forced to spend a lot of money, often having to fundraise to enable them to travel overseas and secure medicine for their children. This is not right. So we welcome this as very much a step in the right direction, but in doing so, urge the Government to do all it can to ensure that this process is robust but is as quick as possible.
Norman.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. So I join others in welcoming this statutory instrument, but I ask the Minister why it's taken so long. I think the recommendation from the Council was in December 2017. Why has it taken 18 months or more to get to this point, given that the changes being made to facilitate research, for goodness sake, wouldn't it have made sense to act immediately on their advice rather than delaying for so long? And can I use this opportunity, Mr Deputy Speaker, also to urge the Government, despite their inclination to go further than this, to embark on a process that focuses on evidence of harm. I'd ask the Minister in particular, does he think that it's right that the policy on drugs should be based strictly on evidence of how we best reduce harm? Because I think if he did accept that premise, he would accept the need for significant further reform. To pick up on the point made by the Honourable Member for Perth and North Perthshire, I would urge the Minister to appear before the Scottish Affairs Select Committee. There is a real danger that if ministers refuse to attend select committees, then it sends out the most appalling signal to anyone else tempted not to respond to a select committee request to give evidence. And this is such an important matter, and the Scottish Government, to give them credit, are wanting to trial new ways. Consumption rooms make an enormous amount of sense. There is evidence that you could significantly reduce deaths from dangerous drug use through this sort of approach. And it really is scandalous that the Government is standing in the way of the trial in Glasgow to allow this much safer approach, standing in the way of good evidence-based policy making. And if, as I say, the Minister accepts that we should be guided by the evidence of what works best to reduce harm, then I think he would inevitably pursue the course of exploring what they have done in Canada by ending the ludicrous prohibition on cannabis, which has brought about the most appalling side effects. It ends up with so many young people being driven into crime, ending up too often with criminal records, being confronted by violence in the poorest communities in our country, the extent to which young teenagers from the most disadvantaged backgrounds are used by criminal networks to sell these drugs and end up putting themselves at risk of extreme violence is really shocking. And if the Government is interested in protecting young people from harm, both the violence that is an inevitable consequence of the illegal market, but also the risks of buying on the illegal market, where the only strains available now in places like London are the most potent strains of cannabis that pose the biggest risk to a young person's mental health, then the government would see the sense of regulating this market, taking the market away from criminal networks. We hand billions of pounds a year on a plate to organised crime in the most ludicrous way. We put young people at risk of extreme violence. We put young people's health at risk. And instead, we could be raising tax revenues to educate people about the dangers of drugs, both current illegal and legal drugs. Because let's remember that the most dangerous drug of all in terms of harm to self and others is alcohol. Alcohol consumed in vast quantities in this very House of Parliament, for goodness sake. The hypocrisy in this debate is breathtaking. When aspirants to become our Prime Minister from the Conservative Cabinet make embarrassing commissions about misdemeanours from their past, when others have been convicted of doing the same thing and have had their careers blighted, let's end this hypocrisy. Let's follow the evidence. Let's regulate the market, take the criminals out of the market and protect our young people more effectively.
Pete Wishaw.
Yes. I'm grateful to you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a real pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman and as a fellow chair of the Science and Technology Committee. He certainly knows a thing or two about good evidence, and it's actually quite encouraging and unusual to see an issue to do with drugs where the government is accepting evidence and doing the right thing. This is a really good statutory instrument. It is a good reform of the Misuse of Drugs Act. Of course, synthetic cannabinoids, which could be used in research to try and develop some of the treatments that we know work, which could help countless people across all our constituencies, should be taken right out of the scheduling when it comes to misuse of drugs. So this is the right thing, but it is so unusual to see them accepting good evidence. This is a government that approaches drugs issues uninformed by evidence and is singularly unresponsive to the development and the debate about drugs issues, the general environment that is emerging and as a feature of all our constituencies and our communities. Turns their face against the international innovations which are springing up from not just Canada, but places like Portugal, places like Germany, places where there is a real different approach to how we deal with the contagion of drugs-related problems that we have within our community. This is a government that's quite immune to the mayhem its general policy towards drugs is currently generating. Mr Deputy Speaker, the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act isn't just in need of minor tinkering, it's in need of widespread reform, review and updating. Now, we are conducting an inquiry into problem drug use in Scotland, and we're doing this because in 2 weeks' time we expect to see that over 1,000 people will have died as a result of drug use. That is 1,000 families impacted by deaths that needn't have happened and things that we could do in order to try and address and resolve this. We had a fascinating session yesterday, and I want to share this with the Minister so you could properly hear it, because we don't know if they're coming to our committee, but you have to answer these questions. The Home Office will have to address the way that it's currently handling drugs issues and policy. So come to our committee and tell us what you're going to do, because some way or other we will get the answers from the Home Office about this. But yesterday's session was absolutely fascinating. We had senior police officers from all across the United Kingdom. We even had a representative of the government's own advisory council on the misuse of drugs. There is overwhelming consensus and agreement that the criminal justice approach to drugs issues isn't working and is failing. It's failing our communities, it's failing our constituencies, and particularly for those bereaved, it has ultimately failed them. We heard not just about this useful statutory instrument where there's a reclassification which is actually liberalising policy, but the constant ratcheting up as a chief senior police officer put it, of drugs classification. Look at the example of cannabis, just generally cannabis. Cannabis was a classified B drug. It went down to classification C, and it's back up to classification B again. This is the continuing ratcheting up that we see when it comes to these things. Now, we're hearing that there's an overwhelming consensus and that something different is required. And that difference is that we have to start to treat drug issues as a health issue, not as a criminal justice issue. And I know that my colleagues within the Health and Social Care Committee are also looking at this to see if the general policy and consequences could be changed. And I'm grateful to the Health and Social Care Committee because on Monday... Yes, of course I'll give way.
Very grateful. I meant to mention this case when I spoke earlier, but there's a case of a family in Norwich who have just had to spend well over £1,000 on a private prescription for their young son who has epilepsy. They won't, as a family, be able to afford more than a few weeks' worth of paying for this privately. How ludicrous is it that that family, desperately in need of help for their young boy, cannot get it through the NHS? I think only 3 prescriptions so far under the NHS.
It's very important. I've allowed it to drift. I don't want it to drift too far from word, out of scope too much. If I can bear that in mind, Pete was sharp.
Mr. Speaker, and that is definitely the point, and it's all about this particularly statutory instrument, because what this statutory instrument will do will help people like the family that the Honourable Gentleman mentions, that will supply the evidence and the research so that this could happen. But it's unacceptable that people currently, because they haven't got this in place, are having to go abroad and they are still being arrested when they come back to the United Kingdom, something that was in the report of the Health and Social Care Committee today. So progress has been made, but we're looking forward not to looking at the whole issue of cannabis when we go to Portugal to see how decriminalisation has worked there. Portugal, which had drug deaths on a par with what Scotland is currently experiencing, practically being cut down to manageable levels because of their approach to cannabis and to decriminalisation. Now, yesterday, as I was saying to the Minister, it was a fascinating session. Let me just tell him something that the Assistant Chief Constable of Scotland said, because it's important for this particular instrument. What he said to us, there are 61,500 problematic users in Scotland just now. It is growing in number. For the vast majority, the end for them is death. And the criminal justice process is actually pushing people into a place where there is more harm. That is an Assistant Chief Constable responsible for keeping people safe. Now, a Minister of his own advisory council said this: we are seeing police creating ways to reduce the harm done by the Misuse of Drugs Act. If we fully implemented the law of possession, we would be creating harm. This is what we are hearing from everybody. But what are we hearing from the government? Well, we don't know, because they won't come to our committee to tell us what they actually feel about this. They're not prepared to come and defend this, which is totally unacceptable. So we now need to hear that they're prepared to come in front of this. But when they do talk about drugs issues, do you know what the policy is? We don't want to send the wrong signal. We don't want to send the wrong signal. Fat lot of good that does to people 6 foot under the ground as a result and a consequence of failed drug policies as part of our ever-increasing drug deaths. Now, the Home Secretary is happy to dispense with all the compelling evidence, everything he hears, all the international examples about drug consumption rooms, because, as he said, of his own childhood experience in his own personal neighbourhood. The government knows the evidence about drug consumption rooms. The government has even accepted the evidence about drug consumption rooms. The only thing the government hasn't done is do anything about it. People are dying. Do something about it. This works. All international evidence shows that drug consumption rooms make a difference. It stops people dying, and it allows them the treatment and recovery services that they should be entitled to. It's appalling that the government has one message on this. The belief that a drugs war could be prosecuted and won. All we need is the kids from Grange Hill and Nancy Reagan singing Just Say No. It is time that this government grew up and accepted the real range of issues when it comes to this. We know that a health approach to drugs issues is required. We know that problematic drug use is a result of a complex cocktail of deprivation, poor mental health, trauma, stigma and addiction disorders. But the government's policy does nothing about this. Now, we want the government to attend our committee to defend their current drugs policy. I say to the Minister again, in summing up, he can get his notes from his civil servants, just to get them to come and say there will be somebody coming to our committee who will give us evidence and is prepared to defend the government's policy, because right now it is unacceptable.
Minister.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for Swansea East and Honourable Gentleman Representative Paisley and Renfrewshire, if I've pronounced that correctly, for a very constructive approach to this narrow SI, which is essentially, as has been pointed out, a tidying up exercise to comply with some requests from our research community. And I'm glad that that has been understood and welcome. Many speakers, Mr Deputy Speaker, have taken advantage of your traditional generosity in straying over the boundaries of this SI into a broader conversation around drugs policy. And you know, let me acknowledge that passions on this run very high. The demand for review of policy will be there. I don't think it will go away. It does, in my view, need to be led by the evidence. Of course, Speaker today presented it from one side of the debate. There is another side of this debate who believe with equal passion that the evidence tells a different story. But I don't think, with your permission, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is a day to have a debate on drugs policy. There's a lot of passion about attendance at the Scottish Committee. I should, if I was unclear in my response, it is because I am not technically the Minister for drugs, and that invitation has gone to my colleague, the Minister with responsibility for the crime and safeguarding, and I'm assured that she will respond in due course, and she has not declined to attend, as has been suggested. Well, I'm assured to the contrary anyway. I'm sure she and officials will have heard the passion behind that request and will respond in due course. But the fact of the matter is today, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the government's policy on legalising cannabis and drug consumption rooms is set. Honourable members will also be aware that a new Prime Minister is a new administration, a new government, and an opportunity to reopen debate where necessary. And I'm sure many members on the House on both sides of the debate will be encouraging that. I should say to the Honourable Member for North Norfolk, the Chairman of the Science Technology Committee, a man for whom I have great respect, I do strongly believe that policy in all areas should be driven by evidence, and that's why I do welcome the fact that the Home Secretary has asked Dame Carol Black to lead one of the largest reviews of drug demand and supply for many years. I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way, and I welcome the appointment of Dame Carol Black to do this work. Will she be able to look at the experience from Canada so that we can look at all options in making our decisions about the right way forward?
Determined to look at all aspects of drug demand and supply, and the terms of reference to the review are public. I wanted just to add, because it is relevant to the context of the narrow debate that I thought we were going to have, that I've also asked, in the interest of updating evidence, and particularly to his point about updating evidence on harm, that the ACMD do review current classification of synthetic cannabinoids in that context, and that review is due to report by summer of 2020, and I hope that he welcomes that. If I may close, Mr Deputy Speaker, just to say something briefly on the issue of medicinal cannabis, which a number of members took advantage of your generosity to address. As the Minister who led the work under the direction of the Home Secretary to change the law at the pace that we did, I am pleased, of course, that we took that step. It was clear to me that it was absolutely necessary, confronted again with the evidence from families who were suffering what I believe to be unnecessary hardship and pain as a result of regulation and law. As has been pointed out, the law did liberalise the situation, but did require for prescriptions to be required by to effectively be clinically led by specialist clinicians. And the reality is, as disclosed in evidence to the Health and Social Care Committee, who reported today, that clearly there is an issue around the levels of clinical confidence at this moment in time, and the government is absolutely determined, and my colleagues at the Department for Health and Social Care are absolutely determined to work very closely with partners to try and build that clinical confidence, which is clearly a priority, so that more families do not have to suffer the pain and frustration that is clearly out there. I'm delighted to give away again. Fine for Ireland.
I'm very grateful for his tolerance. The family that I mentioned from Norwich, what advice do we give them when they're spending well over £1,000 on just 3 weeks' supply of cannabis oil through a private prescription for their son with epilepsy? And as a family, they simply won't be able to afford to carry on. What do they do in that situation?
Well, the legal route which we have opened up is that if the situation complies with the various conditions that the regulations kind of set, that framework, then prescription of those drugs is allowed, as long as that is what is recommended and approved by the specialist clinician looking at that case. He will understand that given where we are in terms of the research base and the evidence base, although our decisions were informed by expert advice, we did have to put in place quite strict conditions in relation to this being clinically led, not decisions by politicians, not necessarily decisions by GPs, but by specialists in this area. I'm sure he will understand the reasons for our caution in that respect. The issue, as I said, now is about how to build, again, the research and evidence base to build clinical confidence inside the NHS system. That is clearly must be the priority at this time. I've enjoyed the debate, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's ranged further than I expected, but I welcome the support for this SI and the proposed changes that have been made following recommendations from the Advisory Council.
The question is that motion number 4, as on the order paper, or as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.